The Communion of Saints is a series that seeks to share information on the life and times of the saints of the Catholic Church. Your program hosts are Father Jim Corda and Father Jack Lavelle.
Welcome to this edition of Communion of Saints. I'm Father Jim Corda.
And I'm Father Jack Lavelle.
Now, the first saint that we're going to talk about today is really a combination of saints. We know them as the Holy Innocents. And we've talked in many occasions how oftentimes when we talk about the saints, they're not necessarily named in the sacred scriptures, but we know that these saints are recorded, their lives in the sacred scriptures. So let's talk about the Holy Innocents.
Well, and when we do talk about the Holy Innocents, noting their feast very close to Christmas, their life story, however short, is very much a part of the Christmas story, though it doesn't happen as quick as people might think. Sometimes we take the scriptures in these little isolated snippets, and we have to remember the event of how the Holy Innocents come about. Very quickly, we know that the Magi are searching for the Christ child. Did this happen the day after Christmas or even on January 6th? No, it took time. And so they come to the house where the child is, but before that they're searching, and so they go to the king because they assume certainly the baby is in the palace. And so they meet with Herod, and Herod is alarmed by what they have to say, but quick enough to try to entice them to come back with knowledge. So we know they are warned in a dream to return home another way. Herod catches on to the fact that they're not coming back, but they've left him with this very uneasy message that there's another king out there. There's this infant who is going to be the king, and he's afraid that this child is literally going to take his kingdom away from him. So not knowing where the child is, not knowing anything other than the approximate time, he dispatches soldiers from his palace to slaughter every male child under the age of 2, ensuring that wherever this boy king is, he's now dead.
Before we continue our historical discussion of the Holy Innocents, let's go back then to the Magi. We know the Magi in Matthew's Gospel, the second chapter. We know that they come from the east because they see this wonder in the sky. And as astronomers, as astrologers, their lives are governed by the stars. And so they see in this one star a sign or a symbol that's leading them. And isn't it interesting that God spoke to them through the stars, but God speaks to us in those practical ways? You know, sometimes people say, well, you know, I pray to God constantly, but for some reason God isn't hearing my prayer. Well, maybe God is responding to your prayer, but you're not seeing it or hearing it or understanding it because we look for God in different places, or it's the answer that God wants to give us that we don't want to hear. You know, so that whole sense that God speaks to his people, and God does continue to speak to us.
Oh, absolutely. I often will joke with people, though I'm not really joking. If we were honest in our form of prayer and reflect on how we approach things with God, we can dress it up in a series of Our Fathers and Hail Marys and rosaries. But oftentimes what we really mean in our prayer is, Dear Lord, here are all the things I want you to do for me, and as long as you do them exactly the way I tell you, no one gets hurt, and I'll still believe in you. But the moment that it's not what we asked for, our belief falters, our trust in God starts to slip, and as you mentioned, we can pray for such specific things to occur that we lose sight of the broader sense of blessing at work in our lives. Someone who prays to win the lottery and doesn't realize that for the 3 years they've been praying to win the lottery, they've never gone hungry. They've always made their house payment. They've always had food on the table. You know, we could go on, but they've never won that lottery. And we do lose sight. And I think we see the star as being this incredible, way that he attracts them. But as you mentioned, they're astronomers. This was ordinary for them. For us, it's extraordinary, but for them, it was an ordinary means to come in contact with the divine. What are those ordinary ways in which we are not opening ourselves up to coming in contact with the divine?
Which brings us to the way that God spoke to Joseph through the angel, to take his wife and his child and flee to Egypt because the wicked King Herod was going to destroy the child. And so we see in that recorded in the scriptures how the angel, God's messenger, spoke to Joseph. And then the angel continued to speak to Joseph throughout Matthew's gospel. Once they went to Egypt and King Herod had died, and the angel said, "Go back to the land of your citizenship." And so he listens to the angel, he packs up his wife and child and moves them to Nazareth. And so there's this whole sense that God, throughout all of this, continues to speak. Sometimes words of peace, sometimes words of being startled, and sometimes words of contentment. And so, we see in the lives of the holy innocents all of these different things that happen. And so in their story, there's this whole sense of good and evil, of hatred and love, of death and new life. So there's all this antipathy that's caught up in their whole celebration.
I think also for the holy innocents, oftentimes what you'll hear people in current times struggle when they see great tragedy. And again, the holy innocents connected with Herod remind us that we all have free will. And sadly, Herod had the free will and the unfortunate decision to worry more about himself, more about his kingdom, and his free will inflicted on the holy innocents. They had free will, but between ages 0 and 2 could do very little to protect themselves. It is a reminder to us that as sad and unfortunate as some things are, there are tragedies that befall this world impacted by everyone's free will kind of interfering with each other. But regardless of that, we can't lose our faith and our hope. Tragedies, illness, sadness, sorrow have been part of the world's human condition since the beginning of time. Do we give in to them, or do we allow ourselves to be raised out of that by following Christ more faithfully?
And we know the holy innocents were martyrs for Christ, and so their feast, appropriately enough, follows the birth of Jesus and their birth into new and eternal life. We're going to talk about another saint in a different time and place in just a moment. Please stay with us. We'll be right back.
Light Moments. Here's Father Tom McSweeney.
Kids in New York City always have someone to talk to, thanks to a hotline run by their peers. Teens from around the city got together to found an 800 number called Youthline. It's an information and crisis intervention hotline run by high school students and college students. They answer the phones 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Teens call in to find out about events in their neighborhood, to discuss boyfriend and girlfriend problems, to report abuse, or just to talk to someone. From time to time, we all feel the need to talk to someone who's really listening. Listening with love is an important gift that you can give. It means making yourself available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Try to be the kind of person that others can call on and count on.
This message from the Christophers, New York, 10017.
I am Marino.
Yo soy Marino.
Marino, an American Catholic organization of priests and brothers, has been reaching out to those in need for nearly 100 years in 26 countries throughout the world. Missioners, workers, volunteers, supporters, we are all Marino.
I'm Father Mike, and I am Marino.
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 Welcome back to our show. Now we're moving from 1st century to 10 centuries later to now talking about Thomas Beckett. And oftentimes as a young child I heard Thomas of Becket. We don't know why that is, but tell us about Thomas Becket. What was going on in the life of England at the time?
Well, Thomas Becket was, for all practical purposes, best friends to the king at the time, Henry II. We're talking about the early to mid 1100s. Henry, at this time, England is very Catholic, and yet there is this sense with Henry that the church is trying to get ahead of itself, that the church really thinks it rules Henry. And Henry sees the need to kind of rein the church in and prove who truly rules England. And yet there was great power in these different sees, these different dioceses. And so what we see is that Henry wants to seize the power of Canterbury, the most prestigious of all of the dioceses. And so there was a rule, or at least an agreed upon process by which archbishops were not appointed without the approval or the recommendation of the king. So the king of the land and the Holy Father would get together in this. And so Henry II is trying to find someone that he can put on that throne, if you will, so that he can rule the church through that archbishop. He goes to his friend Thomas Becket, who had been involved in some way as a young man in the church, though not ordained. What happens is he's ordained a priest one day, he's ordained a bishop the next day, and he is made the Archbishop of Canterbury. And Henry thinks all is right and safe with the world. What he didn't count on was that this ordination, this gift of grace, this newfound role that Thomas found himself in really took hold. It really had an effect on him. And he really started to see that he was a servant of God and a servant of the people and the church. And all of a sudden, there's this great conflict between him following Christ and him being friends with Henry.
And we talked about that before in some other segments with some other saints who found themselves in these similar situations. You know, these are people that were given great privilege and great honor, not only in the life of the church, but also in the life of a royal kingdom. And so instead of necessarily following the orders of the king to the letter, he followed the orders of his true king, of Jesus, the eternal king. So there's this whole sense that he ruled, I guess with an iron fist, you could say, but he did that following the laws and the rules of the church, even to the point of excommunicating those who opposed him. And that obviously was something that Henry did not expect or he did not like.
Absolutely. And kind of if we were to jump 6 Henrys later, we've talked in previous episodes about Henry VIII and some of the saints and martyrs around his time. We see the same thing in that it's not so black and white. Now, we said these two men were great friends. They continued to have great affection for one another. The problem was Henry could not allow his friendship for Thomas and his faith to be more important than him running his kingdom. There's a scene where he really is at some indecision, and really Thomas is kind of pushing him with these excommunications. They're waiting. The king has to do something. Who is truly running England at this point? And there's a story where his mother, who had been the empress of another region before him, says to him, "Henry, do something. Pardon him, kill him, do something." And he, recognizing that really Thomas is his only true friend, he says, "I am, madam. I'm learning to live alone." He knew that the ultimate decision he would have to make, if it was in favor of his kingdom, was that he would now be left alone.
Let's also talk about the remorse of Henry II following the death of Thomas Becket. We've talked about this before, and the remorse really of Henry VIII in the lives of John Fisher and Thomas More. There's this whole sense that what they did was wrong. And so, there's that whole allowing of reconciliation and forgiveness and kind of a conversion. Isn't that part of the life of the church? When something happens that's terrible, either in your life and someone else's, that goes against what the Christian faith is all about, that there's always that time for forgiveness. There's always that time for reconciliation. And that's really sometimes downplayed because we believe we cannot be forgiven for something. And how important was it in the life of Henry II to understand that this tragedy that actually happened basically at his hands, but was something he regretted.
Well, and there are those historians that argue that Henry never really intended for Thomas to be murdered. Supposedly, the phrase that was uttered was, "Will someone not rid me of this meddlesome priest?" And there was a group that took that as Henry asking them to kill him. So recognizing that it's these words that may have brought about the death of his friend, the death of the Archbishop, he does seek forgiveness. Now for us, we can go to reconciliation. We know it's a very private, interior process. The priest cannot say what we have said to him. We're given absolution. Interestingly enough, for Henry, this sense of remorse and this sense of reconciliation had to be public. To really allow people in the church to see this. And so we have this great image of Henry goes and strips himself bare at the tomb of Thomas Beckett with all of these monks looking onward. And he even, as you get into some of the theatrics of it, he's having this conversation with Thomas Beckett. I'm letting them all see this so that people will know I'm sorry. But you get the sense that there truly was remorse. It went far beyond what he wanted to have happen.
And we celebrate his feast on December 29th, and he was canonized just 3 years after his martyrdom. In the life of any of the saints, we encourage the folks that are with us to learn more about them, to find out what was going on historically, but also what was going on interiorly in their own life, and to find some solace, to find some understanding, to find some example that they could follow. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
There is a place where a total stranger will give you their blood. There is a place where someone you never knew will save your child from drowning. A place where people from 7 states away will turn up at your door and give you food and shelter after a flood. There's a place where a person who doesn't look like you, talk like you, or dress like you will stretch out their hand and put it across your shoulders and say, "Everything is going to be okay." That place is called America, where we look out for each other, and it's up to us to keep it that way. When you help the American Red Cross, you help America.
Whether it's passing on medicine, a blanket, or something as simple as a glass of water, that's how compassion works. And that's how Maryknoll works, hand to hand to hand. For nearly 100 years, Maryknoll's been passing on your help to the priests and brothers working in 26 countries around the world. Maryknoll, an American Catholic organization, dedicates 86 cents of every dollar donated to their programs, serving the world's poor and powerless. And that's how it works. Compassion flows from your hand to the hand of someone in need. Hand to hand to hand. That's Maryknoll.
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 Welcome back to our show. Now we're going to talk about Saint Pope Sylvester I. Oftentimes throughout the series, we've talked about the institution legally of Christianity in 313 with the Edict of Milan and the Emperor Constantine. We're going to talk about someone who actually was part of that, who was Pope during that time. So let's try to set the scene for Sylvester I.
Well, we see in Sylvester that he was the Holy Father while the church was still illegal, is the Holy Father during the Edict of Milan, and then continues to be the Holy Father for 20 years after. So not long before the Edict of Milan does he become the Pope, but certainly some very challenging times, not knowing for sure what all is going to be ironed out, how this is all going to play out. We've talked in this series of some saints who were martyred right up until the Edict of Milan. And so, again, we can't just think that, it was so easy for Sylvester. We've talked about some young saints that were martyred in 304 and 305. First, already involved in the church and then elevated to the role of Holy Father just a few years before the edict, he would have really been a key player in how this is all going to play out. Perhaps if Sylvester would not have been a pope that the emperor had faith in, this might not have happened. So we see in him one who really embodied that spirit of cooperation and moving forward, and then is able to really fashion for us in the next two decades what the church will emerge as once it's a legal institution.
It's interesting because when we talk about the lives of the early popes, aside from St. Peter, they didn't reign very long. And here was a pope who was well over 24 years, almost 25 years, and during a time of great growth in the church. You have to understand, the folks that are with us, that this was something significant. This was a time for them to come out of the dungeons and the darkness, so to speak, to actually live and practice their faith without persecution, without martyrdom. There probably was still some of that going on, and no doubt in distant countries that was part of it. But yet, what I'd like to pick up on is something you mentioned about his personality. He obviously had to be someone that Constantine the emperor liked. And not only that Constantine liked, but his mother Helen liked, because she was very significant, as we talked about in another segment about her, that she was extremely significant in bringing about this conversion of her son, because she was a devout Christian and really understood the faith and brought about an understanding of the roots of the faith going back to the Holy Land, to bring back to Constantinople and to the Vatican, these wonders, these significant parts of the life and ministry of Jesus. And so Sylvester had to be someone that was well loved and well liked. And wouldn't you think that the Lord had blessed him with these many years in order to see the church through that tumultuous but yet uplifting time?
Oh, absolutely. And I think what a gift it was to have this constant steward who had the personality to help accomplish this, but then really to set things out. And make no mistake, by God's divine providence, this continuity was allowed to be put into place. The Edict of Milan could have happened in 313. Sylvester could have died in 314, and there could have been turmoil again in the church. And it could have been, let's take the church in a different direction. Remember, there also would have been some voices in the church, now that it's legal and now that we can come out of the shadows, wanting retribution, wanting revenge. And so Sylvester also had to be this voice for calm and for peace and for getting along. I mean, we're talking about the view of Saul to Paul times thousands and thousands and thousands. How can you embrace or accept someone who yesterday was persecuting you? It took someone like Sylvester to bring this calm to the church.
And we also would like to note that during this tenure of his reign as Supreme Pontiff, that the Council of Nicaea in 325 was part of, historically, the church, where the Nicene Creed, the creed that we say every Sunday at Mass, where we believe in God, Father, Son, and Spirit, and also the Holy Catholic Church, the communion of saints, the forgiveness of sins, the resurrection of the body, and life everlasting. So significant in his pontificate was this doctrine of the faith that continues to guide and direct us. And, you know, the church is full of different doctrines and so forth. But the one that's rooted in our faith simply is God, belief in Father, Son, and Spirit.
Absolutely.
Now, we celebrate his feast on December 31st, right before the new year. What do you think there might be some significance about that, celebrating the new year, new life, difference in the church?
Well, we know that on New Year's Day, the preferred celebration is the Solemnity of Mary, the Mother of God, which plays into the development of the Creed, later ramifications from Nicaea into Ephesus and Constantinople. We get this emerging development, not necessarily of who Mary is, but who Jesus is. Is Mary simply the Christotokos, or is she the Theotokos, the bearer of God? But we also see in that celebration on New Year's Day a sense of peace. We pray and celebrate world peace. And so by placing Sylvester at the very end of the year, we see that transition from whatever happened in the previous year into an outlook and a newness of hope and promise in the year to come. So it really is that transition of the church from being in the darkness and shadows of the catacombs into the light of day through Sylvester.
And we certainly celebrate his life and his faith as the one who was there at the moment when Christianity was legalized in the known world. Thank you for being with us. Have a good day, and God be with you.
The Communion of Saints was a production of CTNY, the Catholic Television Network of Youngstown. Your program hosts were Father Jim Corda and Father Jack Lavelle.
What have you done for your marriage today?
I gave my wife a hug this morning. I told her I love her.
I did her hair this morning. I think it looks pretty good.
I cooked my husband's favorite breakfast.
I bought her an orchid.
What have I done for my marriage today? I sent my husband a love email.
I read the newspaper to my wife, and it cracked her up. She's still laughing.
What have you done for your marriage today? Make a change for the better. Need help? Go to foryourmarriage.org, a message from the Catholic Church.